Hello, thanks for joining us today and watching this recorded presentation of risk assessments and you. My name is Michael and I'm one of the team members of the volunteer screening program, and I'll be taking you through this presentation. While we are presenting this in a virtual format, we would like to take the time to offer land affirmation. We welcome you to reflect on your own ties to land as well. Volunteer Alberta's main office is situated on Treaty 6 territory, in an area that holds many Indigenous names but is referred to by the Nehiyaw people as Amiskwaciwa-Skagit and colonially as Edmonton. Our staff, board, and work extend into territories of Treaty 4, 6, 7, 8, and 10, and we affirm the importance of honoring these historic agreements as well as all future treaties. The land we call Alberta is the ancestral territory and present-day home of many Indigenous peoples, including the Nehiyaw, Dene, Yarhe Nakota, Anishinaabe, Niitsitapi, Inuit, and Métis. They have cared for and advocated for the lands, waters, and animals for many generations, despite historical and ongoing harmful actions against their communities. We are grateful for their stewardship and give thanks, and it is our intention to ensure that we become good partners in this work as well. To help communities thrive and illuminate good ways forward for the sector, we must recognize how colonial systems influence how Albertans perceive and participate in volunteerism and civic engagement. This includes considering the historical and ongoing barriers that exclude Indigenous people from meaningful engagement. In the spirit of reconciliation, we all have a responsibility to ensure our organizations can contribute to decolonized, inclusive, and equitable volunteer programming and take action to do no more harm. This webinar is brought to you as part of the Volunteer Screening Program, also known as VSP. It is a partnership between Volunteer Alberta and the Government of Alberta to help support nonprofit organizations develop deeper understanding of volunteer screening and engagement practices toward the broader goal of community safety. Now, when we talk about screening, we're talking more broadly about the process by which you define your relationship with your volunteers. It can also be viewed as the steps you do to ensure volunteers are a good fit and have the tools they need to succeed. You may be familiar with the 10 steps of volunteer screening as defined by Volunteer Canada. All these nuances help us to improve the quality and safety of our volunteer programs. For this reason, for the purpose of this presentation, as we talk about risk assessments, we are using it in the context of volunteer programming. We offer quite a few supports here at VSP, and we hope that they help you along your way. We offer educational resources and tools like this webinar, but also a growing collection of guides and templates which are all stored in our virtual resource library. We also offer one-to-one coaching sessions, but are also happy to just answer quick questions over the phone or email. As part of the financial supports we offer, we manage the Vulnerable Sector Check Fee Waiver Program, which provides fee waivers of up to $15 for volunteer VSCs in participating communities. We also have our Screening Development Microgrant, which opens once a year in the summer. All VSP resources and supports are free to access at any point. No membership needed, no login required. If you ever have any questions, you can always email us at screening@volunteeralberta.ab.ca. We'll also provide this email again at the end. As one small disclaimer, I would want to clarify that while we do offer coaching and support to help you develop your volunteer screening practices, Volunteer Alberta does not provide legal advice. This webinar and our resources will provide some useful general information, but you should bring any concerns specific to your organization and work to a legal professional. So, what is risk? Risk describes the uncertainty surrounding possible outcomes that could result in a negative impact. Or, to put it more simply, it's the possibility of something bad happening. Now, I want to dispel a big myth. This idea that having risk badly reflects on your organization. This is untrue. Risk is everywhere, and no organization or program is immune to it. In fact, it's going to be inherent to the work that we do as nonprofits, especially if we serve and support vulnerable populations. Where risk can be negative is if we don't address it. Ignoring risk means you increase the likelihood that it evolves into an issue that can harm your organization, your volunteers, or your program users. So if you want to prevent negative consequences, don't be afraid to name it. Naming risks allows you to become aware that it exists, its possible effects, and gives you the ability to discuss how to address it. To help you start naming what risk your organization may have present, let's go into a few different kinds of risks to help you categorize things. So, we like to categorize risk based on who would be directly affected. We find this can help think things through a little easier. This isn't the only way to do so though. You can also categorize by topic like OHS, financial, reputation, but for now we'll focus on the 4 different categories. Risk to your organization or program, risk to your program users or beneficiaries, risk to your volunteers, and risks to your staff. It's important to note that even with this more simple categorization, they don't always fit neatly into just one box. If a risk crosses multiple areas, you may say that the risk has a greater possible impact. You may also choose to merge your risk relating to staff and volunteers if a lot of the work they do is the same. We've listed a few examples of different risks associated with these categories. For example, an organizational risk may be that a volunteer damages your organization's reputation by speaking or acting inappropriately. Or a risk to your volunteers may be that a shift partner doesn't show up so the volunteer is all alone during their shift. We suggest you take the time now to pause the video and think of some examples from your own organization. Remember, risks are possible outcomes with negative consequences. So even if you have never experienced a risk becoming an issue or having an impact, list those that you're aware could exist. Okay, so we have talked about what risk is, but what now? Well, you've already started by thinking about what risks are present, so let's dive deeper into doing an actual risk assessment. A risk assessment is the process by which you identify and assess the possible risks that might be present or could occur. This means looking at their likelihood and their possible impact as well. We recommend that to get the most out of your risk assessment, you also look at the mitigating factors that are in place to help address those risks. And we will go into a bit more about the different strategies to respond to risk later. I want to briefly pause here and talk about one of the risks of risk management. Often in doing risk management, we can come at things with a very negative lens as we are viewing things in the worst possible way. What is the worst that could happen? It could make us fearful, overly risk adverse, or even make us avoid doing the whole thing because we don't want to be stewing in the negativity, or we fear that the risk will paint our organization in a bad light. So how do we address this? Well, first of all, looking at the positive benefits of risk assessment can help. They can help protect your organization so it can better achieve its mission. They can help protect your program users by ensuring you're informed about how your safety measures are working. It can reassure funders that your program stewardship is centered on care and accountability. And it can make your volunteer programs more engaging. Like I said before, when you do a risk assessment, you should also be looking at the protective factors, all the things that are going right or are mitigating the risk. Just because a risk is inherent and part of what your organization doesn't mean you aren't already doing the work to prevent the risk. Again, a solid risk assessment looks at all of these areas and can show you the bright spots in the work that you're doing. So let's get into some examples of what a risk assessment can look like, because there isn't one correct way. It all depends on your program and what resources you have available. Remember, a risk assessment should be thorough but reasonable. Essentially, it shouldn't be overly onerous on your organization to conduct. For example, needing to close down operations for 2 months to dedicate all of your staff to completing it, but it should still provide useful information and actions that are achievable. Additionally, you need to balance your risk mitigation with addressing potential barriers to volunteer engagement, operations, or accessibility. Checklists. These are pretty common tools, and we in fact offer a template on our website called the Risk Assessment Checklist for you to use or modify to fit your own needs. This slide offers another template example that shows how one organization added some specific areas that they want to know as part of their own process. Checklists in general allow you to list potential risks and then measure them. We specifically highlight 2 measurements. What is the likelihood of them occurring, and what is the level of impact if they did occur? In this way, you can see what risks may need to be ranked higher in priority to address, or what risks may need more intensive mitigation strategies. A helpful tip. Creating a risk matrix like the one we offer can help you scale your assessments in a standardized way, which can help you better measure the risks and reduce the impacts of subjectivity. One thing I would recommend is ensuring that your scale doesn't have too many levels. Something like 1 to 10 could be too much, as then it's more likely things get rated in the middle, as most folks are less likely to rate things on either end of an extreme. This is known as central tendency bias and would muddy the assessment and could mean you don't address the risks appropriately. Another helpful tip, you can modify the scale to measure the risks with controls and without controls, just like the second example chart you can see here. This can help you understand if your controls are working, if they need to be adjusted, or if the controls aren't necessary anymore because the risk on its own has decreased. Individual position assessments. You can choose to focus individually on each volunteer position to better understand the nuances of that specific role. For example, what responsibilities does the role have? What risks may be involved? And what supports and mitigation factors are needed to ensure that anybody who takes on this role is successful? We also offer a template for this, as you can see on the screen. We provide multiple question prompts to help you describe your role. Things like, what is the purpose of the role? What duties does this role have? Who do they interact with and serve? On this point, we recommend being clear on who the role inherently is made to interact with and who will just be incidental. You also can look at what settings they will be in. Is it a public area, behind closed doors, or is it always changing locations? Will it be outside? Do you need to take into consideration weather conditions? And then also things like time commitment to be in the role. And what does the supervision and training look like? Do they need to have specific certifications? Do they have one person they can report back to? Is that person always physically present, or is there a way for them to contact? Will they be working in groups or with other staff or volunteers present? That kind of thing. We hope that in answering these prompted questions that it helps you then identify what risks are present in the role. From there, you list policies and procedures that relate to the role. Ideally, you have policies and procedures that mitigate each of the risks you identified, but you may find that there are gaps that need to be addressed or duplication that's not necessary. A helpful tip. It's important when assessing volunteer positions that your position descriptions are up to date and accurately reflect the role. The older a role description is, or the longer it's been since it's been reviewed or updated, the more likely that you need to do some deeper assessment to ensure that paper matches practice. As well, be aware of what roles may have some flexibility. Are there certain volunteers in that role that have slightly different responsibilities or duties than other volunteers in that role? Flag that. Remember that according to the Freedom of Care Act, volunteers are offered liability protection only if they are acting within the outlined duties and responsibilities of their role. If you have volunteers who are regularly doing work outside of their designed role, that's a risk. Consider if you need to redesign the role, create a special role description just for them, ask the volunteer to stop, or accept the risk. Seeking feedback. Another way you can assess risk is by seeking feedback from volunteers, staff, or program users, all those who directly interact and engage with the program. This can be done through surveys, interviews, suggestion boxes. Also, don't feel as though these need to be overly formal. An interview can also just be a friendly check-in conversation, and a survey could be just a 3-question postcard. This method is especially helpful if the person who is conducting the risk assessment isn't directly involved in the day-to-day of the program, so may only know what the program is by paper. And as we all know, in reality, programs often are adapting and adjusting to things we did not predict when we originally submitted the program proposal. So asking your volunteers and program users a direct question like, how safe do you feel? Or do you feel well prepared for this role? You can also ask indirect questions like, what's something you wish you could do in this program, and what would you tell a potential volunteer about this program? These can help you better understand how things are being implemented in practice. It's also a good idea to use a mix of both personalized and anonymous feedback. Anonymous may get rid of the bias folks have to give only good feedback and give more unfiltered insights and help foster a bit more trust. We invite you now to take the time to pause the video and think of some examples you use currently or may want to use in the future to gather feedback on the safety and success of your programs. So, who should be in charge of a risk assessment? It depends. Ideally, it should involve the people who are directly connected to the program that's being assessed. Like I mentioned before, programs on paper sometimes don't match in practice. So if someone who is a few steps removed from the program is in charge of the risk assessment, they should be sure to involve those who are directly within the program itself. This includes program staff, volunteers, and even program users. When it comes to assessing the volunteer program in its entirety, it can be especially helpful to have a volunteer coordinator or role who is a specialist in building volunteer relationships. For OHS-related risk assessments, depending on the size of your organization, you may have a health and safety committee or a representative to involve. Also consider sharing the responsibility. Instead of having just one person in charge of a risk assessment and mitigation, using a risk committee can help. This can lighten the workload and ensure a more deeper understanding of risk and the ways to address risk. Some organizations have this as purely a board responsibility, some have it as a leadership team item, and others have a cross-section of staff and volunteers from multiple levels. The more people with varying areas of knowledge and perspectives can help you view your programs from all angles. If going this route, be sure to make the purpose of the group clear. What responsibilities they have both as a group and individually. Are certain folks in charge of certain areas because of their expertise? Will there be committee chairs? Who is in charge of follow through for implementation or scheduling future assessments? That kind of thing. So identifying risks and assessing their impact isn't the final step. Now you need to react and respond. Are there risks that need to be addressed, further measures to implement, or are there risks that have reduced or are no longer relevant and your measures are now too heavy so can be adjusted to free up resources? On an earlier slide, I briefly touched on the ways to react to the risk with the example of volunteer position descriptions. There are 4 strategies commonly used to categorize how to deal with risk. The first is to avoid. If something poses more risk than benefits, you may choose to remove it entirely, especially if it's not a core activity you need to operate. This could look like ending a program or event, or even removing a volunteer role. Now, this isn't ignoring the risk, this is fully removing the situation involving the risk so it no longer is present. For example, you opt out of doing a kayaking event for your youth program. You can also transfer the risk, which is when the responsibility of monitoring and mitigating the risk is transferred from one source to another. This could be transferring externally, like with insurance, or it could look like transferring the risk from a volunteer role to a staff role by moving responsibility from one to another. For example, you opt to have hired kayak instructors lead the kayak event for your youth program who use the organization's liability insurance. Mitigate is the most commonly discussed response. In fact, you've heard me say it quite a few times already. And the actual implementation of it varies based on the type of risk, your own expertise and resources, and the sustainability of the practice. But essentially, this is working to actively address and act against the risk. For example, you require mandatory safety training and parental consent forms before the youth are able to attend the kayak event. And finally, you can just accept. You acknowledge the risk, but do nothing further. This is usually for risks that are not likely to happen or may have too small an impact to dedicate resources to resolve it. For example, there aren't enough vans to bring all the kids, so you accept that some parents who aren't screened volunteers will just carpool. Your response strategy may be to take bits from each of these, and it may involve multiple steps as well. There's a commonly used metaphor in risk management called the Swiss cheese method. You may find that some strategies only cover certain areas of risk, but not all, leaving holes in your cheese. But the more you layer on, each strategy with its own holes, the more gaps you're able to cover. But I want to bring up the concept of reasonable measures reasonably applied. Be sure that you're not stacking that Swiss up too high where it becomes impossible to eat. It needs to be the perfect balance between addressing risk while still being practical and doable. You also want to be sure you're not creating excessive barriers for engagement. If you find that you're unable to justify or explain why a certain procedure or tool is used and how it may mitigate risk, there's a good likelihood it isn't doing any favors for your program. So you may want to look at how you could adapt or remove it so it does make sense for you. And finally, make sure you're doing your risk assessments regularly. Whether that's every quarter or at the start and end of every program year, make sure that you continue to review, analyze, and monitor your risks. Make it a habit, make it a part of the natural way you do things, and make sure that it makes sense for your program. And remember, volunteer screening is a way to mitigate risk, but it isn't a risk assessment in itself. It's probably one of the most commonly used risk mitigation factors for volunteer programs. They can help address safety concerns, it can help you match volunteers to the right role to support your mission, and it can help you understand what support you need to provide to allow your volunteers to thrive in their roles. After your risk assessment, you should be able to infer not only what screening tools you want to use, but also how they're being used in practice. Essentially, risk assessments inform your volunteer screening. Like I mentioned before, we recommend reviewing the risk mitigation strategies you have in place as part of your risk assessment, and reviewing your volunteer screening practices, including if there are different screening requirements for different types of roles you have, is a really big part of this. All of this should help you understand how and why your different screening steps are used and allow you to update them as needed. I don't mean just adding or removing different steps, but also modifying the tools you already use. This could mean updating your application forms to have different questions, or implementing different formats to increase accessibility, or looking at what questions you ask during interviews. Like I mentioned, this could be assessing if different roles need different screening. For example, roles you assess with higher risk may have more screening tools or specific questions asked of them, or additional training. It can also mean you implement different supervision and feedback methods, implementing one-to-one check-ins, casual drop-ins to supervise, having conversations with program users and their family. If you've ever attended our other webinars, you know we've been highlighting relationship-based screening. That is, centering your screening practices on the human connection and mutual understanding. By welcoming volunteers as part of the process in safety and risk management, you're able to create meaningful opportunities that naturally build safety and promote volunteerism, strengthening your program as a whole. We often talk about the interconnection between policy and risk. While it's true that not every policy is directly made to manage risk, it's also true that because they often establish responsibilities, expectations, and guidelines that can help inform good practices to manage risks. Policies help ensure that we are proactive and can help inform your team of what should be done and how to deal with scenarios should they occur. Prioritizing a well-researched, effective policy means that the time spent now will save time later when incidents might occur, instead of scrambling to address a risk if or when something does happen. In other words, a little bit of effort now saves a whole lot of time and stress later. Just like risk assessments, policies should be regularly reviewed, so we just recommend you consider this to be part of your risk assessment process as a whole. Does this policy make sense in the context of your program today? Do you believe it will make sense in the context of your program tomorrow? Is it informative? Will a volunteer be able to look at it and understand the responsibilities and expectations, or is there a risk of misinterpretation? Is it easy to find and access? Are there any external factors that need to be integrated? Federal or provincial legislation, your program's national body's policies, or even your insurance provider's rules? All of these can be questions you ask when reviewing a policy to ensure that the policy itself doesn't create risks. On that note, insurance is one of the many tools your organization can use to manage risks and liabilities. While it isn't the only thing your organization should consider, it can be incredibly helpful. The first thing to remember if you're shopping around for a commercial insurance plan is to look for representatives who have a good understanding of your organization, or at least similar types of organizations. Don't be afraid to ask them questions. Also, be prepared to provide a list of assets and property that are related to your organization: vehicles, computers, office space, etc. The quoting process may involve a little back and forth. The next thing to remember with insurance when you do have it is that it's important to keep your insurers updated with changes to your organization's operations. How you conduct programming with the public, including the types of programs you offer, can have an impact on your coverage. Even things like changes in organizational structure are important to note. Adding or removing staff roles, hiring a new executive director, or updates to your bylaws. Whenever you make any substantial changes to operations, including your volunteer programs, be ready to ask your insurance representative if your coverage is still applicable. It's important to be comfortable talking to your insurer, and we strongly encourage you to maintain this relationship. You are paying them for a service, and they are there to answer your questions, so be sure to maintain a clear line of communication with them to ensure that your coverage matches what you need. Don't be afraid to set up annual or biannual check-ins. A helpful tip: on our previous slide we talked about policies and risk, and when your policies are out of date or you aren't following them, that's a huge risk to losing your insurance coverage. Insurance providers look to see if your organization is ignoring your own policies and the rules that you set, and if you're willing to ignore those, they consider you a liability and may decide not to insure you, or even increase your premiums because you are higher risk to them. And that brings us to the end of our presentation. Thank you for the time you took to watch this recording and the work that you do to keep our community safe, engaged, and thriving. If you have any questions or would like help accessing any of the resources we mentioned in this presentation, please feel free to contact us at 780-482-3300 or by email at screening@volunteeralberta.ab.ca. Have a great rest of your day, and thanks again!